Another half minute or so to check in. Okay. So last time we began discussion of the problem of evil in Kabbalah. Okay? And I sort of gave you the basic outlines of the problem from a more traditional / rabbinic point of view. Okay? The problem is if you believe that God is good and that God is all powerful and that evil is something very real, then something's got to give in one of those. They just don't fit together. And how do we resolve that problem? Right? So, we already saw one text back in the first lesson that talked about evil having been created by God, that evil was an element that was part of the creation. And by the way, that verse is something you can find significant support for in Scripture. So, for instance, give you from Lamentations chapter 3, which says, "Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and evil come?" In other words, God creates evil as well as good. Or from Isaiah chapter 45, "I form light and darkness, I make good and evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." Okay? And by the way, that verse was co-opted into our liturgy, so that if you look at the morning service, whether it's weekday or Shabbat, doesn't matter, right after Baruch, it says, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam. God is Yotzer or Uvorei Choshech. Yotzer or Uvorei Choshech, that God is creator of light and makes darkness. Okay? Except that in the original verse, it said, Yotzer or Uvorei Ra, who creates light and makes evil. Okay? So that's a little more direct. When the rabbis put together the liturgy, they probably thought that one didn't go well with your morning coffee. And so they changed it to, who makes peace and creates all things. Okay? You shouldn't have to confront the creation of evil by God first thing in the morning. Okay? But this is part of the foundation of a view that suggests that evil exists in order to serve the good, and that you can't expect God to produce good without having some evil within the universe. Right? Because without evil, there's no moral choice involved. Big deal, to choose between good and good. Where's the virtue in that? If everything is all good and you have no choice about creating about doing good or evil. What's the virtue in doing good? So, in the mystical tradition, you find many statements that kind of open us up to the possibility that God creates evil, or at least creates a universe which makes room for evil. So, for instance, in the early mystical book, Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Creation, says God has set each thing to correspond with another, the good against the evil and the evil against the good. Right? So from this, the existence of evil comes from the way that God created the universe. Right? The nature of the creative process makes a space for the creation of evil. And the 16th century Kabbalists in Tzfat, they built on this approach. You also have modern theologians who refer to the evil element, the kind of random and irrational factors that are built into creation. Lurianic Kabbalah describes destruction, evil, imperfection as necessary parts of the process of creation. God cannot create without destroying. It's not because God is not perfect, but that the creative process of necessity implies the possibility of destruction. Creation, therefore, is by nature imperfect. Right? And so, and the creation has to have evil as well as good. Evil is a part of created existence, right? And along with the idea that we saw in the last lesson about Tzimtzum, God's contraction, God pulling back into God's self, God has to relinquish space. God has to relinquish absolute perfection in order to be a creator. And so that also has an effect that makes for the possibility of decay and evil within the universe. Now, what this means for us is that we have some power over creation. Our actions, if we sin, we can amplify those flaws in creation. If we do mitzvot, if we do good deeds, right, we can reduce those flaws in creation. Right? So we are, you can still have, in this view, a God that is perfect, but also have a God that is creative, where creation implies the necessity of destruction. Okay? Now, in the earliest Kabbalistic text that we have, back in the 12th century, this book called the Bahir, we come to see an idea that, illustrates this concept. Right? So here on your share screen, you have this first text. A king had a beautiful daughter. Others desired her. The king knew about it, but could not fight those who wanted to bring his daughter to evil ways. In other words, he can't protect her from all the imperfections around. Right? He came to his house and warned her, saying, "My daughter, do not pay attention to the words of these enemies, and they will not be able to overcome you. Do not leave the house, but do all your work at home. Do not sit idle, even for a single moment, and they will not be able to see you and harm you. they have one attribute which causes them to leave aside every good way and choose every evil way. When they see a person directing himself along a good way, they hate him. And what is this attribute? It is the Satan. Remember Satan? Now, this teaches us that the Blessed Holy One has an attribute whose name is evil. It is to the north of the Blessed Holy One, as it is written, this from the first chapter of Jeremiah, from the north will evil come forth upon all the inhabitants of the earth. Any evil that comes to all the inhabitants of the earth comes from the north. Okay, so a few observations about this text, and then we'll take comments and questions. The idea that God has a quality called evil exists even in the very earliest rabbinic tradition. It had, because we have there the notion of midat hadin, the quality of judgment. And that is a force that testifies before God against human beings, right? You do something bad, it evokes the quality of judgment within God. And sometimes the ministering angels function as this, as maybe even Satan himself. But here, evil is one of the powers of the forces through which God manifests himself. So evil is actually present within the sphirot, within the emanations of God into the world. So what's the solution? The daughter is told in this parable, do all her work at home, meaning internally, right? Concentrating on the virtues, concentrating on a life of holiness. God cannot eliminate this evil aspect. But if you don't sit idle, and if you just work on it all the time, if you work against that evil impulse within you, you can manage it. You can keep yourself from sinning. By the way, why was evil associated with the north? Because in the Judean kingdom, Jerusalem was protected by valleys, except from the north. That was the direction from which they could expect an attack. So, if you face east, right, towards Jerusalem for most Jews, north is on your left, which in Kabbalah is the wrong side, because that's the side where din, judgment, power sits. And that's a place where evil might potentially enter into the world. Okay. Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Ann. You have to unmute yourself, Ann.
So if there's a world to come, which these people believe there was,
Yes.
and if, as they believed, there would be only goodness, how is that possible according to what you just said?
Well, because that's a different, that's a world that is purified from all the traces of evil.
But
presumably, well, I don't say presumably, one possibility is that after death, one receives certain measures of punishment based on whatever you deserved, and that purifies you, and then you go forward into the world to come where you receive, your more permanent reward. Okay?
also,
That's one approach. Rose, you had a question.
Yes, when you were saying that we all have this evil within us, now God gave us this evil, but is he allowing it to happen? I mean, he's not making it happen. So when someone does something wrong, that's the free will of the person. But he's allowing it to happen without stopping it. because we
Yes,
have an evil inclination. Is that
yes,
right? Okay,
yes.
thank you.
So God, God creates each of us, for example, with the evil impulse, because otherwise there's no virtue in being good, right? So we have that impulse, and from our earliest childhood, we learn to manage that, right? Um, every one of us has an ego. I like to think that I know better than anybody else until, for the umpteenth time, I am shown that it's not true, right? Right? But I keep thinking that, I just, it just comes naturally to me. So all the time, I have to be working on that. I have to manage that impulse within myself. Otherwise, I'm vulnerable, right? So uh, it's not that God forces me to sin. That would sound fairly Christian in terms of the idea of original sin, right? But it does suggest that God allows a place for evil to enter the world. Okay? Yes, Ann.
Didn't we learn before that there wasn't any evil until the vessels shattered?
Well, that is a part of the view of Lurianic Kabbalah. Okay? The shattering of the vessels, and that makes it, the vessels which contain these aspects of light are meant to protect us, meant to provide a measure of holiness which prevents evil from having its power. But with the shattering of the vessels, those sparks of light get scattered all through the universe. So that little myth, right? And I don't mean myth, I don't mean to say it's not real, but it is the myth of Lurianic Kabbalah, that with all of those scattered around, our job becomes to restore those holy sparks to their proper place so that we can better bring about the world that God intended us to create.
The word myth can mean a story that symbolizes the way the world really is.
Right. Yeah, Bernice?
Yeah, when God contracted to leave space for others, is that when evil and Satan came into being, or what is the origin of evil and Satan? Were they created by God, or do they occupy the space that is left by God?
The answer to your question is yes. Okay? So, I mean, don't form it as an either or, because both of those are suggested by different Kabbalistic thinkers. Okay? Now, more often, those thinkers will shy away from the idea that God actually creates evil.
Mhm.
And they will lean towards the notion that God allows a space where evil can trip into the world. But it's not as if the other isn't a possibility too. Yes,
Thank you.
Daniel.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So let me try to walk through what I understand the logic is. Creativity, creation can't exist without evil being in the world. And the logic is that when you create something, something is destroyed. So, but where that leap there doesn't happen for me is that when you're creating something, something can be destroyed in the sense that things change.
Yes.
And not every change is evil. We can think of a birth as a change, obviously, and we can think of a murder as something has changed, but those don't have the same moral weight at all.
No,
So that's where I
however,
lose it. I lose it right.
however, creation implies at least the possibility of destruction. Right? So for instance, I write an article, okay? And in the course of it, I find that there's a better way to express an idea. And so what do? I erase what I have written and substitute something else for it. That erasure is a form of destruction. Now, not all destruction is bad, but destruction does imply the possibility of bad, of evil. Okay? And, let's look at it just from the point of view of mortality, right? Human beings do not live forever. We decay. It's a very personal statement for me, by the way. I feel myself getting older all the time, right? So I know something about decay because I can feel it happening more than I wish to discuss in detail, right? So, at the same time that I can teach and I can preach and I can do all sorts of things that I think are positive, my mortality forces me to confront the idea that there is something negative that is also happening. It's a bad thing that I'm going to die. Bad thing, very bad. I'm sure not everybody feels that way about my dad, but most people would at least give me the benefit of the doubt on that, right? At least from my perspective, right? So, even in the creation of me, right, involves the decay of me and the end of me. And that's not good. So there's the balance between immortality through wanting to have a world to come and a place in a world to come, and the Woody Allen version of immortality, right? Woody Allen said, I want to achieve immortality by living forever, right? Guess what? That's not very likely. Okay. So therein is the problem. All right. Other comments or questions before I go on? All right, let's take a look at the next text. This is a really, really interesting piece from the Talmud, which has had tremendous effect in our tradition. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi raises a contradiction within one verse. It says, God made the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day and the lesser light to dominate the light. Okay, so what's the contradiction in the verse? It describes them as two great lights, and then it distinguishes between them. Right? The one is bigger than the other. So, we all know who we're talking about here. We're talking about the sun and the moon, right? And we know that the sun shines a lot brighter than the moon. Well, so, you can look at the moon as long as you want, right? Do not try this with the sun. So, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says, that it didn't start out this way. That when God first created them, they were equally bright. The moon said before God, Master of the universe, can two kings serve with one crown? In other words, you can't have two heavenly bodies like this, which are equally great. One has to be greater than the other. God said, that's a good idea, moon. Go and diminish yourself. And the moon says, well, why me? All I did was tell you the truth. And God says, here, I'll give you some compensation. You go and rule during the day with the sun, and when the sun is gone at night, you get to shine then. And the moon says, what's so great about that? I'm going to shine along with the sun? Big deal. What use is a candle in the middle of the day? God says to the moon, okay, go let the Jewish people count the days and years with you. And maybe that would be compensation. And the moon says, you know what? That's not a big deal either, because they count with the sun as well. It is impossible they will not count seasons with the sun. In other words, the fact that we have a lunar calendar is, it's really lunar and solar, right? So we modify the calendar based on the sun too. That's why we have leap months every, now and then. And God, finding the moon unsatisfied, said, go let righteous men be named after you. And just as you are called Hakatan, the lesser light, there will be Yaakov Hakatan, Shmuel Hakatan, David Hakatan, and there are scriptural bases for all of these. You're welcome to check them out if you like. And God sees that the moon was not comforted. This is like crummy compensation for being made into the lesser light. And the Blessed Holy One finally says, bring atonement for me, since I diminished the moon. And this is what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says. What is special about the goat offering of the new moon, that it is stated with regard to it for the Lord? What that means is God says, this goat shall be an atonement for me, for God, because I diminished the moon. In other words, God is atoning for his own sin in having diminished the moon. God sometimes has to make choices, and some of them are unfair, right? It's just like, we all get dealt a certain hand in life. Some of those are not equal, right? If you got a crummy hand in childhood, it's too bad, right? But, eventually at a certain point, a person has to live with that, right? But this says, you have a case. You have a case against God. You're going to have to come to terms with God, but God sinned in not giving you what you should have had in your origin. What does this suggest for us? What do you get out of this? Yes, Ann?
Does that mean that God sins? And all the
Absolutely.
time when he has to make these choices, all the time?
Yeah. Not just
Does that mean
because,
it's okay to
son
be
of the moon.
angry with God?
I'm sorry?
Does that mean it's okay to be angry with God for?
I guess so. The moon was. And God ultimately says, you're right. I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I had to do it, but I had to give out something unequal, right? And it wasn't fair. That's my sin. It's on me, and I have to atone for it. So even God messes up. Right? I think many of you have heard me mention this article that my teacher, Rabbi Byron Sherwin, Olav Shalom, wrote called, Portrait of God as a Young Artist, right? That's, God who creates different worlds and then sometimes destroys them, right? Portrait of God as a young artist, right? Yes. Other questions or comments? All right, then. Let's go back to the next text. So this is from Rabbi Sherwin, right, about this text. It says, in the Talmudic text, God is described as having made a flawed creation and as having sinned. Even more remarkable is this text's assertion that human beings may act to atone for God's sin. After all, we're the ones who actually carry out the offering that's described in this text. And in this view, evil is an ontologically necessary component of existence, and perhaps even a theologically necessary feature of the divine. Rather than concluding that the necessary existence of evil leads inescapably to nihilism and despair, rather than perceiving the human condition as one of random victimization, right? Everybody gets an unequal hand. This position asserts to the contrary that the human person may become an active protagonist in the ongoing battle to contain and to control the evil element within the self and within the world. And this approach aims at reducing the power of evil in the self, in the world, even within God, by means of redemptive deeds. This approach perceives evil to be a fact of life, a feature of existence to be reckoned with, rather than a problem to be solved. In other words, has to be managed, not solved. All right? So, last week I talked about the limited God approach, that God is not all powerful, right? That's, let's say, the position of Rabbi Harold Kushner, right? Why bad things happen to good people? It's because God can't control them all, right? But here, what Rabbi Sherwin is talking about is that, the mystical tradition, especially within Lurianic Kabbalah, gives us a whole different way of approaching this issue. It accepts the presence of evil as a necessary element in creation. Now, Heschel has also written on the confusion of evil and of good and evil within the universe that goes back to the very process of creation. And that was recognized by the sages in this next text, right? A midrashic comment on the verse at the end of the creation story. God saw all he had made and found it very good. So why does it tell us at the end of this story that God found it very good? We've already been told that the parts of creation were good. Now it says, they're very good. Rabbi Tanchuma opened and said he brings everything to pass precisely at its time. The world was created when it was due, and it was not fit to be created earlier. Rabbi Abahu said, from here we learn that the Holy One went on creating worlds and destroying them until he created these. And then he said, these please me, those did not please me. And Rabbi Pinchas said, the reason for Rabbi Abahu's statement is, and God saw all he had made and found it very good. These please me, those did not please me. All right? So Rabbi Tanhuma uses the verse from Ecclesiastes, or brings everything to pass precisely at its time, to understand it's very good only because it's created at a particular time. And Rabbi Abahu goes further. Said the world is very good compared to something else, to previous worlds that God created. And those worlds, our world may not be so perfect, but compared to those worlds that were created beforehand, our world is really impressive, right? So there are two important points within Rabbi Abahu's teaching. One of them is the possibility that this world is not the main goal of existence, okay? Maybe some other universe is going to be brought about, which will supersede this one, right? So think about that possibility, okay? And then the other thing, which is our main concern here, is the assumption that God's creation is not perfect, right? It may contain elements of imperfection and even evil. And that even before the first human being is created, okay? And certainly even before the sin of Adam and Eve. So the roots of the idea that evil is built into the framework of creation, that can be found long before Kabbalah comes around. And we'll see that the Zohar picks up on the theme of previous worlds that didn't make it. And that may have been an inspiration for the idea of the breaking of the vessels, Shvirat HaKelim. Okay, comments and questions up to here? All right, hearing none. We've already seen that, I'm sorry, Ann, yes.
I read somewhere, I don't remember where, maybe you can enlighten us, that the world was not considered very good until evil was added. Am I
Yes.
remembering that wrong?
No. And I think that's implicit in what Rabbi Abahu is saying in this text. Okay, so back to the share screen. We've already seen the idea that the evil impulse, the Yetzer Hara, serves a divine purpose. But the notion that God creates evil might seem a little more radical if it hadn't been explicitly mentioned in the Bible. And I shared with you this verse before. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Okay? So some of you will remember that back in the first lesson we had some weeks ago, we saw this parable from the Zohar about the king who hires a harlot to tempt the king's son. Right? And that, so she is deserving of reward and praise because she serves the king's purpose. Right? So same thing here. This school of thought in Kabbalah sees evil, even though it depends on other forces, evil is the instrument through which good can be achieved. And that, people are provided with the choice to do good, and therefore, evil is the other side of that. But evil has a proper place within the world. Okay, let's look at the next little piece, right? Which is just, kind of an add-on explanation for this from Tishby's mammoth book. if you ever want a collection of Kabbalistic texts, something that breaks down the Zohar into different themes. This is a 3-volume book of the wisdom of the Zohar. Some of you might find it good for insomnia. Others would find it interesting, and you'll only need a small second mortgage in order to pay for the set. But what he wrote here is interesting. He says, whenever man opts for evil, God brings the power of evil into play against him. Consequently, the evil inclination which seduces and leads man astray, the accusing angel and the angels of destruction who chastise and kill, are all the creatures of God, and they all act on his instructions. Right? In other words, evil is a part of the creation. It serves a divine purpose. And you're looking like that's very upsetting.
Well, the rabbis don't ask, why do bad things happen to good people? They ask, why do the righteous suffer? So that contradicts this text. The text says that only those who are doing evil are suffering, but in fact, it's more often that the righteous suffer, or at least as often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those flaws that creeps into the creation, isn't it? Yeah, Lou.
Well, that's why we have to have an afterlife.
If that could fix it. Yes, Lou.
So these these last 2 texts, the one-liner and the paragraph, how are we to look at this in terms of evil that's actually used? So when it says God created evil, does God direct the evil against wherever he wants to direct it? Or is it like there's an inventory of evil out there and somebody can go grab a piece of it and throw it into whatever chaos he or she wants to?
Yeah, I think more often than not in Kabbalistic texts, it's the second. It's just, it's out there to be tapped into if you do. Right? It's not that God organizes it and sort of, sets it out like a laser in a particular direction. It's just out there. That's I think the more frequent, which I guess is a little less scary, but it does seem now and then, like with Job, that the laser is sent in certain people's direction. Okay. So
And
once
in
in a
Job's
while,
case,
you will find that too.
Job was righteous.
That's what it says. So, but in spite of that, God sends or allows Satan to direct that suffering onto him. Okay. Another neglected piece of our tradition. Because, we never use the book of Job in the synagogue. There's no liturgical place where we sit and study the book of Job. Yes,
Elie
Ian.
Wiesel studied it a lot.
I'm sorry?
Elie Wiesel studied it a lot.
Well, yeah, well, that's kind of fit his project, didn't it? Okay, so back to the Zohar. The Zohar does not flinch at the idea of God as the source of all evil, okay, as we will see here in this text, number 7. Rabbi Eliezer was sitting before his father, Shimon Bar Yochai, and he said to him, if there is a defender in the world, it is found in the Matronita, which is code language for the Sphira of Malchut, Shekhinah, the 10th Sphira. And if there is a prosecutor in the world, it is found in the Matronita. It's right there also. Why? How does that happen? Right? So he continued, this may be compared to a king who had a son from his Matronita. As long as the son does the will of the king made his dwelling with the Matronita. Whenever the son did not do the will of the king separated his dwelling from the Matronita. So it is with the Holy One, blessed be he, and the assembly of Israel. And again, Knesset Yisrael is code language for Shekhinah, the 10th Sphira. As long as Israel does the will of the Holy One dwells with Knesset Yisrael. Whenever Israel does not do the will of the Holy One, God does not put his blessing with the assembly of Israel. Why? Israel is the firstborn son of the Holy One. As it is written, says explicitly in Exodus, Israel is my firstborn son. As long as Israel are remote from the palace of the king, it is as if the Matronita is remote together with him. Why? Because the Matronita did not enforce the rules and strike the son to guide him on the upright path. The king never strikes his son. In other words, God never directly, in this view, God never directly does evil to someone, but leaves everything in the hands of the Matronita, the lowest of the Sphirot, to govern the palace, to discipline her son, and guide him on the path of truth toward the king. Okay? So, just, remember the codes in here. Matronita and Knesset Yisrael are both code language for the 10th Sphira. And if you fill that in, the statement here is very simple. Now, do the will of the king. Do what God wants you to do. Keep God happy, and then there will be no evil. Right? But sin sent into the Sphirotic realm causes evil. Right? And, God's positive energy is supported by good and holy deeds. But there's also a negative energy up there, fed by evil deeds. Right? So God has the capacity to do things which are evil. So this is a view of God which, you really, it's very challenging to absorb because it can make God not only as potentially evil, but even potentially abusive. And in fact, on this basis, one of my teachers and colleagues, David Blumenthal, has written a book partly informed by other theology, but certainly informed by this notion in Kabbalah. And the title of the book is Facing the Abusing God. If you're interested in it, you can find it. Okay? Facing the Abusing God. But that kind of theology is not for the faint of heart. Okay? So that is one way of looking at this text. You can also look at this text in a different way, which says that God is just, God is a little bit distant from God's creation, right? Because God has kind of delegated the discipline to the Matronita, Shekhinah, Malchut, the 10th Sphira. And if she disciplines the child, Israel, right, then everything works out fine. If not, then if they don't follow the rules, then we're going to have bad results because God, as represented by the higher Sphirot, does not connect with God at the lowest of the Sfirot, Shekhinah, right? And as we know that from basic Kabbalah, that's bad for the cosmos, and it's bad for us. That's when evil kind of rules the universe. Comments or questions? Yeah, Rose?
Would you go back to the the other information that you had up? Because it said,
You got speak up a little bit more, Rose.
I'm sorry, would you please go back to the other information that you just closed?
To the text from the Zohar?
Yes. And above that, it says all the creatures of God, and they all act on his instructions. So that all of the evil is acting on the instructions of God. And now you're coming here and saying that man can control it. So does man have free will, or is God controlling this?
And the answer to that too is yes. In other words, both of those are true statements, right? God has a certain degree of control. God creates a certain direction for the universe, but we also have a place, right? And we too can affect the cosmos. When we send positive deeds, mitzvot, up into the cosmos, especially with the proper intention, that has good effects. It even wipes out the result of sin. It's like cosmic Drano in the Sfirot, right? Washes away all that gunk that our sins create. If we send up more sins, clogs up the system even worse than it was before, makes the universe more under the control of evil. Okay? Yes, Ann?
You remind me of when Shlomo Carlebach was in Houston in 1979, and he spoke at the place. Anyway, he said, among other things, and I remember this, he said, God is constantly raining down good, pouring the rain, pouring the waterfall of goodness down on us, and we come with thimbles. He said, prayer, which is a good thing, is making buckets so that we can collect the good that he's trying to give us.
Yeah. I like that. I think probably Karl Bach was quoting a Hasidic source, and I can't pinpoint it. But yeah, there is this notion that if only we came with the proper tools, if we had a bucket instead of a thimble, we would be able to collect that shefa, the divine flow that God is constantly raining down on us. Because after all, there is no place from which God is absent, right? So that shefa, that flow is always coming down. The problem is sin sometimes reduces our bucket into a thimble. Okay, that's another way of expressing, the problem of, the system up above, which is kind of clogged. Okay, Lou.
Yeah, so I'm kind of, I'll use the word, I'm sensing that there are two different interpretations of Shekhinah, one being the Malchut, the lowest of the Sfirot, and the other being the feminine presence of God that we welcome on Kabbalat Shabbat. But with regard to the lowest Sfirot, that I didn't think the Sfirot were active. It was that our behavior affected how the connections were between them, and that they weren't actually directing goodness or evil inclination in us, which is a little different than what this last segment says.
I think, if I understand you right, Lou, that yeah, there's a place to say that you know, there is I don't know how to express this, but yeah, there is a certain way in which the Sfirot, you know, they don't change us. They're, you know, just a conduit through which we operate and have an effect on the levels above. That really what we do is we change ourselves in response to those different levels. I'm not sure I'm making myself clear, and I'm not sure I'm addressing your question. But I think it's clear that, you know, there are different approaches in the Kabbalistic tradition about how the Sfirot function. Okay, sometimes they, you know, there is that masculine and feminine thing that's going on, which is kind of a balance between the different Sfirot, and sometimes it's the connection between it, you know, the divine force that is inherent in the Sfirot, and us. Okay, and it works both ways. Works both ways. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we close up for today?
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you all
Rabbi.
for-
It was a good one.
Thank you. I hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much for being here. And we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you,
good day,
Rabbi.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank